Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Winston Black to discuss the mid-14th century outbreaks of bubonic plague, and in particular, we'll be discussing the most famous of the outbreak waves, known colloquially as the Black Death or the Great Mortality. Dr. Black is a historian of medicine and religion in medieval Europe and the Mediterranean, and is currently the Gatto Chair of Christian Studies at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Okay. His research focuses on medieval pharmacy, drugs, herbs, and spices, and the interactions between medicine and theology in the High Middle Ages. Dr. Black, thank you so much for joining with us today.
You're welcome, Hunter. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this with you.
Well, I figured before we dive in to the subject matter directly, we may discuss and clarify our terms and terminology before that. And I figured we could just ask, what do we mean when we use the terms bubonic plague and Black Death? What do those two terms mean?
Yeah, it's a good idea to get our terms settled here, because just plague has come to metaphorically represent almost any terrible disease or even terrible event. But plague is now a recognized and specific disease caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. And bubonic plague is the most infamous form of that and the best known of several varieties, but the one that causes the horrific swellings in the neck and armpits. When we talk about Black Death, it's often just used interchangeably with plague, but when historians use it, we're referring to a specific outbreak of plague, and that's the worst and first outbreak of what we now call the Second Plague Pandemic. So this is probably, we think, the deadliest outbreak of plague in all of history in the 14th century, usually dated about 1346 to 1353. Black Death is sometimes used to refer to almost any historical plague outbreak, but we want to be more specific here to refer to that 14th century, later medieval, devastating pandemic.
Interesting. So if I can then follow up with a question, are there then any recorded instances of outbreak of the plague of Yersinia pestis prior to the Black Death of the 14th century?
Yeah, absolutely. Plague has been with humans for thousands of years, but as we've come to understand it better over the last century and so, historians and epidemiologists have recognized three major pandemics. That's called that the one after the Black Death, the second pandemic. The first pandemic began in the 6th century. Usually dated to 541, and is often associated with the Emperor Justinian in the Eastern Roman Empire. He actually got it and survived, but that plague would continue to strike Europe and the Near East and probably beyond for a good 200 years or so. So it used to be believed that that was the first appearance of plague in human society, but new scientific developments have shown that Neolithic people even got plague. There's evidence of people as early as 3000 BCE with plague. So it's been with us for a long time, but for some reason, we're still exploring these reasons in both the 6th and then the 14th century, and then again in the 19th century. It exploded onto a pandemic level.
And then another thing I wanted to ask was, when it comes to the plague, is there only one type of plague of Yersinia pestis that comes about? Are there different types of plague that are presented and recorded during the outbreak of the plague in the mid 14th century. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's one of the terrifying and fascinating things about Yersinia plague. This single pathogenic disease-causing bacteria can manifest in the human body and animals too, in multiple ways. And as I said, bubonic plague is probably the most common and the best known when the bacteria overwhelm our lymphatic system. And that's what causes the buboes. Those are the lymph nodes in our neck and armpit and groin. Those are the main places, but we've got some other lymph nodes where they swell up with excess, certainly poisoned lymph and pus. But the bacteria can overwhelm the human body in several other ways. Probably the other way that was recognized in the Middle Ages, I mean, they could clearly see the buboes. That's why they took the term bubo, which is Greek for groin. But what was now called pneumonic plague is where, as the name suggests, it infects the lungs and then is transmitted, like COVID, respiratorily through coughing and sneezing. And that's even deadlier and probably more contagious than bubonic plague. It has a much easier interpersonal transmission. And then probably the third most important form, it's hard to tell if medieval people really recognized it because it's hard to identify without a microscope, is septicemic plague, where the actual just bloodstream is almost within hours overwhelmed by the rapidly multiplying bacteria, leading to bacteremia, being overwhelmed by bacteria, and then sepsis, and often death within 24 hours. And that can even happen today. There's medieval records of people who were healthy 1 hour and then dead the next. We'll never know for sure, but in a plague context, it seems likely that those could have been septicemic cases. Now, those are the big three, and those are still the three that are recognized by Center for Disease Control in the United States, World Health Organization, but we are now recognizing that there may be other forms that especially come from eating plague-infected animals. One is called pharyngeal plague, where it actually gets the pharynx, the throat, and gastroenteric plague, as it suggests it infects the stomach and gastrointestinal tract. And there's a number of cases of that from people eating plague-infected camels. And it ends up the same way, though, almost certain death unless you get immediate antibiotic treatment.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
If I may ask, then how do these different types of plague come about? Is it simply how the Yersinia pestis enters your body through the bloodstream? You'll get septicemic. If it's through respiratory, you'll get pneumonic. Is that how it comes about, or?
A little bit. It gets a lot more complicated than that because in many ways, every version of plague will turn septicemic in the end. That's what kills you, usually. But the primary transmitter of plague is most likely the flea. And it seems in most cases, when you are bitten by an infected flea, the bacteria can, in many cases, then enter the lymphatic system where your body goes into overdrive trying to deal with it. But in some cases, I believe if the flea can directly bite and inject the bacteria into the bloodstream, that's when it can turn septicemic. Whereas if you've gotten it either of those ways, it can then get into the lungs. If you live long enough, you can then develop essentially pneumonia, pneumonic plague. And it's in those cases when you're coughing and sneezing or simply breathing around other people, they can inhale the expectorated, still active bacteria.
And if I may then ask, how do we know what we know regarding the outbreak of the bubonic plague in the mid 14th century? Specifically, the Black Death. Is it based solely on written chronicler accounts? Is it archaeological evidence? I mean, how do we know what we know?
Yeah, and that's a great question, in which not too long ago, essentially when I first started studying plague, let's say 15, 20 years ago, the answer would have been simpler, where we could have said primarily written chronicles. We have a huge wealth of evidence from medieval Europe as well as from Islamic society in the 14th century, 14th to 15th centuries, where these were increasingly literate societies that left an abundance of records, chronicles, legal reactions, letters, death accounts, the list goes on and on. And very often they would describe what was to them a very new disease. And the descriptions are very clearly plague. We want to be careful about what's called doing retrospective diagnosis. We don't necessarily know what people were suffering from in the past, but the descriptions of plague are so diagnostically clear in the 14th century that it's generally been assumed that, and rightly so, that this was Yersinia pestis caused plague. But yeah, more recently, there have been a number of significant archaeological investigations, really since the mid 20th century, that have uncovered and carefully studied, which are what's often called plague pits. I don't like that term. In some cases, they really are bodies simply thrown into a pit. But in other cases, they are more carefully organized and planned cemeteries. But in either case, these can sometimes be dated accurately to the mid 14th century, where large numbers of people of all ages die in a short period. Again, quite certain that these were caused by the plague. But what I'm getting to here is really the revolution that's happened in the 21st century in the study of genetics and specifically paleogenetics. This is the recovery and study and reconstruction of the DNA, or what's called aDNA, ancient DNA, of long dead species. This could be 50, 500, thousands of years old. But scientists now have the ability, working with archaeologists, to find, it's often sort of broken up and corrupted DNA, because it can be centuries old, of Yersinia pestis bacteria, of human beings, of animals, rats, fleas, anything that may have trace amounts of preserved bacteria can help us understand not just plague, but any sort of questions we might have that could be answered genetically. But the big advance came in finding and identifying plague bacteria within the skeletons of medieval people. And this can be difficult because the only place that DNA usually can survive is within tightly enclosed spaces, within bones, or especially within teeth. But amazingly, after 700 years, the pulp within our teeth, if they haven't been broken, can still survive well enough that it can contain traces of human DNA, plague bacteria DNA, and other microscopic species. And so in the last 15 or so years, paleogeneticists have been able to find that DNA in human teeth, test it, prove that these human bodies were overwhelmed. They got septicemia essentially in their last minutes, last hours, and that they were full of Yersinia pestis from the DNA. And so this was the decisive scientific proof that we never had before. And now many hundreds of skeletons have been identified with plague DNA in them, not just in 14th century Europe, but in the 17th century, as I said, in Neolithic bodies, in the first plague pandemic. all of them proving these people died from or had Yersinia pestis in their bodies.
I'm sure that also, with respect to these archaeological finds, it also helps account for demographics and how widespread was this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. When we have large enough cemeteries, plague assemblages essentially of bodies that then can be dated, yeah, we can see, as you suggest, children and adults, men and women, showing just how universal the plague was. It cut down everyone indiscriminately, at least at first.
Right, right. And then another question I had was, how exactly do medieval historians and archaeologists account for the rapid spread of the plague during the mid 14th century? As I understand it, as you said, it's what's usually the culprit for the spread of the plague is fleas, which I believe it's through rodents and marsupials that they spread the plague. But one of the concerns I always had with that was, if it's through rats and fleas, those rats and fleas must have been booking it for lack of a better term. And did travel have a hand in this? How do we account for the rapid spread?
Yeah, you've touched on some fascinating and very difficult questions that still haven't been properly answered. The yeah, we've got a problem here and trying to explain how did plague apparently spread across all of Eurasia and more in just a few years. When is you suggest it's not the fleas and rats moving. We often get cartoons that represent just waves of plague rats moving. Yeah, the simple answer is it's people. It's people rather than the hosts or vectors, which are the rodents and insects, or all of them together. But we still got another problem here. Modern plague is still a highly deadly disease. But even in its worst outbreaks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, plague killed no more than about 2% of any given population. This is primarily in India and Hong Kong and China around 1900. Whereas medieval plague killed, we think now on average, of 50% of at least the Middle East and Europe. You'll often see 1/3 as the ratio trotted out. No, it's almost certainly over half. We cannot yet explain genetically or epidemiologically why it killed so many people so quickly. A fascinating wrench thrown in the works also is now that we have the DNA of medieval plague, we can also now, and geneticists, I haven't done this, geneticists have done this, they've reconstructed the whole genome, the genomic map of 14th century plague bacteria. What they can show is that, like any organism, it has evolved over time, but it has not evolved much. It's different than viruses like COVID, which change every few months quite significantly. A bacteria is actually a far more complex actual organism, unlike viruses. And what we can see is that modern plague is only slightly different from medieval plague. And it's not different enough that we can point to genetic changes to explain the differences in mortality rate and spread. So, a long way of saying we don't know.
Okay.
That is where, and this is what's exciting for me as a historian, where eventually we reach the point where geneticists and epidemiologists sort of shrug. We have to then look at the historical context. And this gets to the second part of your question about, human agency, where we're now exploring more deeply or reinterpreting major events of the 13th and 14th centuries, most notably the spread of the Mongol conquest and the Mongol Empire across much of Eurasia. as potentially being one of the causative forces that helped spread plague so rapidly and maybe initiated the third plague pandemic. We think possibly by disturbing or destroying rodent reservoirs across Central Asia. And the DNA plus the historical evidence is now showing that it seems almost all plague pandemics begin in Central Asia and again are disturbed or mutate genetically and are moved by people who get infected or move the fleas or disturb. It can be marmots or jerboas, not just rats, any range of rodents. We have to look to those activities to explain how does it move from the rodent reservoirs to large-scale human populations.
Did travel and trade have a hand in carrying rodents or rodent populations to different ports? I mean, as I understand it, one of the preventive measures that some cities took was to try to bar travel and trade in certain ports where they didn't want people coming in.
Yeah, definitely. I pointed out the Mongol conquests, but possibly one of the more important long-term causes of the spread was more peaceful trade and travel, especially between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent and Europe and North Africa. And that the big area in between that is essentially all the lands of the Near East and Eastern Europe around the Black Sea. And this area in particular was then and is still now one of the most important grain producing regions in all of Eurasia. People need grain. It is their main food.
Right.
And rodents love grain as much or more than people. And so recent historical work that is now also building on the genetic work is showing that it's not the movement of rodents, but the movement of fleas that is probably going to be the main culprit. So you have on land around the Black Sea, on ships in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, they move slaves and treasure and spices, but they especially move vast amounts of wheat and barley and other basic staples. You're going to have some rats on these ships, but you're going to have fleas on the rats and people. So evidence now that rat fleas, probably still the primary vector, in desperate straits can actually eat grain dust. They love blood, but they're an amazing little insect. And if they're starving, they will eat grain dust. And so another way they can survive long-term in overland caravans and in ships. Every human being had fleas then too. They had the human flea, which is a different species, but there's probably some movement between wild rodents and I call them human rats. These are essentially the black rat that loves people, and also movement between several insect vectors, lice and ticks, the rat flea, human flea, and others. So it's not just rat to human. There's a huge, complex, zoonotic is the technical term, animal disease and human disease epidemiological network that we have to look at to explain plague.
Very interesting. Okay. And then one more question that I had with sort of just the demographics, you might say, is was the outbreak in the 14th century regulated to areas that we would refer to now as just, Western Europe? I mean, you've been talking about how there's a lot of travel and trade in the Mediterranean area. So were there instances of bubonic plague in parts of Africa or Asia Minor, or what would you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've been hinting at already, referring to Mongols in Central Asia, we're increasingly recognizing that plague is not just Boccaccio and Chaucer. This is not just medieval Europe. It is definitely pan-Eurasian. if not the entire Old World, Afro-Eurasian. Where we have the best documentary evidence is, as I mentioned from the start, Europe and Islamic lands, so Middle East and North Africa. So we have lots of doctors and chroniclers and religious leaders all talking about the plague in the 14th century, Christians, Muslims, and small numbers of Jews also living within Christian and Muslim society. The big change that's also been coming in the last 20 or so years, along with this paleogenetic revolution, is a recognition that plague was almost certainly in the Chinese Empire, throughout Central Asia. We don't have the documents, but we're finding increasing genetic and archaeological evidence, and also in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's large regions like sub-Saharan Africa or Central Asia that we don't have the documentary evidence and have very little archaeological evidence. But now that we have this genetic framework and sort of a more open-minded view of how plague moves, it's looking like it's everywhere. Not in the Americas. It doesn't reach North and South America until the third pandemic, when steamships moved from Hong Kong to San Francisco around 1900. So no plague in the Western Hemisphere until the modern era, but yeah, almost certainly everywhere throughout the medieval and early modern period in Afro-Eurasia.
So I figured maybe we could shift course to discussing how the medieval people in the 14th century reacted to the spread of the plague. How did medieval people diagnose the outbreak of the plague, and what were some of the ways in which they attempted to maybe treat the disease?
Yeah, I mean, here is one of the areas where, I mean, we always should be skeptical about medieval reactions and how they describe it, because it's coming from their own personal framework. But their descriptions of plague, as I mentioned before, are spot on almost to modern diagnoses. So we have, and here I'll just focus on the Western European documents I know best, but mentioned, yeah, Giovanni Boccaccio in the prologue to his Decameron. We've got a contemporary, also in northern Italy, named Gabriele de Musis, and a number of other chroniclers and doctors. They all make the same diagnosis. Now, they don't know what plague is the way we know it, but they recognize this is a new and terrible pestilential disease. This is how they describe it. And they see that people get terrible fevers, prickling on their bodies, extreme lethargy and high fever, and then they break out into the buboes or begin coughing up blood. And pretty much across Europe and the Islamic lands, these descriptions of from medieval accounts are almost identical. And so they very quickly create a set of diagnostic symptoms that are pretty reliable. Trouble is, as plague becomes endemic in Western Eurasia and recurs again and again, it seems probably some people who have other kinds of serious fevers, perhaps from typhus or malaria or something like that, may get diagnosed with plague. Or conversely, people who have septicemic or pneumonic plague, but not the buboes, they might not be diagnosed as plague because, of course, they don't have the microscopic laboratory genetic tools that we have.
Right.
But once they decide that an individual or a population has plague or is in danger of plague, what almost all medieval doctors would do is, rather than just throw up their hands and say, oh, we have no idea what this is, they amazingly tried to fit it into their medical and theoretical framework. They were amazingly resilient that way, and in some ways conservative also in their ideas. They did not let go of what's often called the Galenic and humoral framework for disease. These ideas that Galen, second and third century Greek and Roman physician, he didn't invent these ideas, but he formulated them most clearly. The idea that all disease is caused by an imbalance or corruption of your four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And that basic concept was really absorbed wholly, not just by the Christians, but by Muslims and Jews, pretty much anyone in the greater European and Mediterranean world. If you were an educated doctor, this is the medicine you do. This is how you explain disease. And then this is also how you prevent or treat disease. And so they would come to explain plague as an extreme corruption of your blood as one of your four humors caused by pestilential air. This is air that has essentially become diseased in its essence. So they don't know about germs, but they're on the right track. They recognize that something bad is in the air, or the air itself has become bad. And that's literally what malaria means, bad air. Malaria is a different disease, but they're thinking of it in these terms. So many doctors, especially during the Black Death, would not really try to treat the disease. There was a general recognition, once you got it, it's in God's hands. But they would offer abundant advice and write hundreds of pages of documents of prophylaxis, of how do you prevent getting plague? How do you protect yourself? And most of it took the form of recommendations that had been around for hundreds of years of how to prevent other diseases, and usually other fevers. Keep yourself cool. Avoid excessive hot baths. Avoid excessive sexual intercourse. Avoid foods that were believed to heat the body too much, like red wine and roast beef and spicy foods. So all of these environmental and dietary attributes were believed to make the body more susceptible to absorbing the bad air and then becoming infected by the plague. I mean, so that's where we can see how medieval people are in some ways looking quite modern, but thinking in an ancient and earlier medieval framework. They clearly recognized that this is a disease that somehow moves through the air and moves rapidly from community to community, from person to person. And they needed to fit that, or they wanted to fit that into their learned medical framework. But where they start developing some slightly new ideas is focusing more on this concept of infection. Now, again, need to emphasize, germ theory doesn't develop until the 19th century,
Right.
with the microscopic identification of pathogenic bacteria. But where they're seeing how this is moving so quickly, they're exploring, okay, how is it moving? They never actually identify the rat flea nexus. Instead, they focus on the question of what are people doing that maybe is moving infected people from place to place, or moving the bad air, even when the people aren't infected. And so, as you hinted at earlier, how some cities, especially in Italy, which is so tied by seagoing trade to Africa and Asia, they would begin to look for ways to assess travelers and traders. Eventually, they even quarantine them off because of fear that would often be explained that their goods, whether it's their grain or especially cloth, there was a deep distrust of cloth that was believed to actually become infected or trap pestilential air, what eventually gets called miasma in the case of plague. So they're looking for we'll almost call them proto-scientific explanations for the transmission of disease. I really want to emphasize this because so often modern audiences assume that stupid,
Right.
superstitious medieval people just gave up and said, help, God wants to kill us all, or it's demons, or whatever. Um, some people did believe that. But learned doctors, city governments, educated people all shared in this intellectual framework, which looked to natural causes and tried to seek natural explanation for disease etiology, its cause, its spread, and its treatment. Now, it doesn't mean they reject the role of God in all of this,
Hmm.
but first and foremost, they are looking for natural explanations.
Right. Right. And with respect to the bad air, I've heard it sometimes called its miasma theory. How exactly did they account for why this was suddenly spreading? If I remember correctly, there was a commission done in France that a royal commission that argued that it was a result of like planetary alignments that brought about the bad airs. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It's, yeah, one of the most fascinating documents from the start of the Black Death. In 1348, as the Kingdom of France, and especially the French royal government, they knew the plague was coming. Plague travels fast, but messengers travel faster, even in this period. And they knew that the Italian peninsula and Provence, with now southern France, was being overwhelmed with this disease. So King Philip VI uh, hired the medical faculty of the University of Paris to produce an official statement on cause, prevention, and treatment of this coming pestilence. I should note here that they almost always call it pest or pestilence, never plague or rarely
hmm,
plague. That was their preferred term. But these doctors who are also astrologers, to be a good doctor in this period, you also really have to know the stars and planets. Um, they grappled with this question of, okay, this disease is caused by bad air. But they've known that for a long time, that bad fevers are caused by bad air. Again, we come back to malaria, which is widespread throughout the Mediterranean in this period. They don't know the connection between mosquitoes, but they know the connection between swampy areas, bad air, and getting this feverish disease that they call bad air,
hmm,
malaria.
right.
So, by analogy, they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get so much miasma that it overwhelms entire kingdoms? So they're going to look to big causes. And what they identify is in 1345, 3 years earlier, there was a conjunction of three planets. They essentially line up from human perspective in the sky. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all line up in the constellation of Aquarius. So if you're looking at the night sky from France, you can see them line up. You can see them with the naked eye. Harder these days with smog and light pollution. But and what's fascinating is historical astronomers have shown that this really did happen. They're not making this up. From their medieval astrological medical viewpoint, they believe that the planets and the 12 constellations of the zodiac all had a direct influence on the Earth.
Hmm.
So astrology was a science. It wasn't really a superstition. It wasn't magic. It's on the edges of science. So the idea is the wetness of Aquarius, a water sign, provokes the fiery heat and anger of Mars. They don't believe in Mars as a god, but they believe that Mars, the planet, is somewhat like the ancient god Mars. Jupiter, they knew was in some ways the king of the gods, the biggest and strongest planet. They don't believe in the Jupiter or Zeus, but they think about this about Zeus. And then Saturn is a corrupt planet. Saturn is slow. It's associated with lead, the heaviest of metals. So a lot of ideas going on here. What this does, according to, and this ideas they're shared by the everyone, Muslims, Christians, and Jews who follow astrological medicine. This is like right out of Star Wars. It's like the Death Star.
Right.
It creates a super-powered ray of corrupt, wet, hot, poisonous influences that blasts down to earth and corrupts the air, if not everywhere, in one major area.
Okay.
From a European perspective, they actually think it began in Asia. They were in some ways right, but they're right for wrong reasons. And so certain regions of the earth get so overwhelmed by the most corrupt air that had ever existed, and this air begins to move, brought by people, pushed by winds, exacerbated by earthquakes. There was a major earthquake in northern Italy and the Balkans in January 1348. Everybody pointed to that, said, aha.
Right.
So that either pushed the poisonous air or unlocked more bad air from within the earth. So not everybody agreed with these ideas, but what everyone is looking for is some source of corrupted, pestilential air that then gets moved or breathed in by people and then creates the plague within them.
I see. Okay. So we did a good job looking at like maybe what the learned doctors, how they diagnosed, and some of the preventive measures that they've sort of prescribed for dealing with the plague. But if I may also ask, how did the ecclesial church respond to the outbreak of the plague? Was there like a sort of suspension of public mass or the sacraments? Did the sacraments take on different like administrative, parameters? Like what can you say to that?
Yeah, and here at the start, I want to preface this by pointing out again, so many modern people have the tendency to create this false and overly strong dichotomy between science and religion. That's really a post-Enlightenment attitude. And there's a lot of myths, these ideas that, oh, the church was anti-science and they tortured Galileo. They didn't, but they did arrest him. and so these are often imposing modern misconceptions on the medieval church. Medieval church leaders were trained at the same universities and together with the doctors, and they did not reject the scientific explanations. But, okay, that was a long preface, but I want to get to the point. Obviously, church leaders, we're here especially referring to the hierarchy of priests, bishops, up to the Pope in Rome. Their main concern, obviously, is for the well-being of individual souls and the salvation of the entire Christian community. And so they have to look immediately to as you say, the administration of sacraments for the dying and the dead. Now, today, in reaction to COVID, churches everywhere were able to immediately switch to Zoom services or something like that. People just stopped going because of the recognition of the contagiousness of a viral disease. Sadly, from a modern perspective, medieval people didn't think that way. Probably there were some who were simply afraid of crowds.
Okay.
But most good Christians instead would react by increasing their engagement with their faith, which was a communal affair within medieval Roman Christianity. You can't do this at home. No, there was, as far as I know, no suspension of Mass anywhere. In fact, there was a dramatic increase in Masses. The performance of votive Masses, specific Masses to ward off the plague or to protect communities, and a great increase in religious processions. Here we see it's not a Mass, and it's in some ways safer because they often would be outdoors. But priests, bishops, even the Pope himself would lead their communities in long marches around their community to religious sites, really for the purpose of asking God's forgiveness. So Medieval people could do both things. They could understand that plague was a natural disease with natural causation and natural treatment, while at the same time, everything is caused by God.
Mm,
God is the creator and cause, the first cause and prime mover of everything. And God knows that this is happening. And therefore, there is both a scientific and a religious explanation. But then they're looking for why. What did we do?
right.
Or, or what did we not do that is causing God's anger to impose this disease upon humanity? Uh, and here's where we see a huge range of explanations. Everything from we've stopped fighting the Crusades against the Saracen infidel. They'd mostly stopped after the 1290s. Or to something as local as in England, they were very concerned with cross-dressing and pointy shoes.
Oh,
They would point all the time, oh, those women, they're wearing pants, or those young men, they're wearing shoes that are too long. And
interesting.
so,
Okay.
um, uh, or to much darker issues of we have let the Jews live too long.
Mhm.
There's really anti-Judaic apocalyptic readings of the plague. So, yeah, in the big picture here, the church is doing everything it has in its religious arsenal to try to appease God's anger. But then they're also thinking about the individual. So, the main thing that a Christian needs at this point is proper administration of the sacraments because it's assumed that they're going to die.
Right.
And that will essentially mean last confession and extreme unction are the last rites, which ideally both will be performed by a priest and both will be performed by your own priest. The idea of having your own priest do this had vanished long ago. As people are moving around more, there's a recognition. Any priest can perform these if you can't reach your own priest. But when people are dying so quickly and are potentially contagious to other people, some bishops, not all of them, but some recognized that we need to let these people perform their last confession to anyone,
Mm,
that they can confess to any layperson, some would say, and one English archbishop even said, even to a woman. So
right.
I've seen jokes about confessing to a horse, but I'm not sure if that was.
Interesting.
I think it's important that you confess to a rational human being. But in these dire straits, there's a recognition that God will hear.
Mm,
And you might not be able to get to a priest or a priest to you. So they have to make these concessions to the hemispheric emergency.
right. Right. And then, if I may ask, were there any attempts made, if any, to establish maybe not hospitals, because, as you said, treatment wasn't something that they were too concerned with, but an enclosed environment to house plague victims? Was that something that was ever done?
Yeah, absolutely. But not immediately. I mean, not during the Black Death itself. The initial Black Death is only 5 to 7 years, and was so deadly. As I said, average of 50%. So some places 20%, some 80%. There's no possibility of establishing a formal institution of care within that framework. But then plague kept on coming back. And that's one of the things that's especially terrifying about plague. Roughly every 15 to 20 years, plague would reappear within Europe and the Middle East, possibly other places that we don't understand well enough.
Hmm.
But if we look at the European focus, European communities begin to set up permanent buildings. Eventually in England would be called pest houses. In Italy, lazaretti, which actually was their name for a leper hospital. Lazars, another name for lepers. So in some cases, older leprosaria these leper buildings, leper hospitals, would be converted into plague hospitals, or new places would be built and still retain the older name. But we don't want to think of these places as treatment. There's really no treatment.
Sure.
Some people would begin to claim that they could cure the plague, but for the most part, there's a recognition if someone has the plague, what we need to do is isolate them,
Mhm.
possibly provide them what we might call hospice care, but otherwise, um, the goal is to isolate them from the healthier community. And so these pest houses or lazaretti would often be outside the city, even on an island in the case of Venice and other Italian port cities. Um, so they would serve a function both of protecting the city, so their sick people might be shipped there, but also protecting the city from outsiders. And we've used the term quarantine several times here, but that concept is first used here in a number of these Mediterranean ports, Venice, Dubrovnik, and others, where they would isolate incoming ships, initially in some places for 30 days, which would be called a trentine, or eventually 40 days, a quarantine.
Okay.
Different places would have different periods of time, but there's a recognition you need 5, 6, 7 weeks, either for the people to die or to guarantee that an incoming ship is not diseased.
I see.
So yeah, there was a number of methods used to try to partly help the sick people, but mostly it's to protect the still healthy.
I see. Okay. And then if I may then ask about the aftermath of the plague, or specifically specifically the Black Death. What were roughly some of the socioeconomic consequences of the outbreak of the Black Death? You know, I mean, are there changes with respect to questions of medicine? Are there socioeconomic consequences? What can you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic and one we can only briefly touch on here. But yeah, not surprisingly, this is what has fascinated historians most after the Black Death, anyway. I mean, tragically, but pragmatically, the millions of people who died are no longer part of history. And so
Hmm.
when we're studying the later 14th and 15th centuries, we're obviously interested in how do the survivors and their descendants react? Do they create a new society? How do they learn to live with plague? And we see in different areas, cities and kingdoms and so on, there's going to be very different socioeconomic reactions. In places where um, serfdom or manorial arrangements had been dominant, sometimes those fall apart as surviving peasants are able to pay for or demand their freedom. Other places we see the reverse, where a relatively free peasantry is then forced into semi-servile status. Or if we look at more urban environments, especially northern Italy, Florence, the biggest city there, the aftermath of the plague is associated with much more modern sounding urban uprisings, revolutions of workers, demanding what we might now call workers' rights, civil rights, and so on. So we don't want to paint the Black Death and its aftermath with a single brush. You need to understand the unique economic and social contexts of different areas. If we look at the subject of medicine and health, you might assume that medieval people would suddenly realize that, well, our medieval medicine doesn't work. Um, but as I hinted at the start, amazingly, their medical system, this combination of ideas from Hippocrates and Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, Islamic doctors like Avicenna and Averroes, a whole group of ancient and medieval authorities. The system that had been built around their ideas still lasted for several hundred more years. Because there was no cure for plague, they continued on explaining it in the terms they knew. On the other hand, while there was no revolution, no pioneering changes, some people are starting to think a little differently because they're looking at this disease, which is so contagious, so rapid, so interpersonal, something we know all too well now after 3 years of COVID, that not overnight, but gradually, European doctors are thinking differently about disease causation. Some of them start proposing the idea that a disease might have a seed, or to use the Latin root, a germ, that there's some sort of invisible, we would now call microscopic, force or thing or particle or creature that moves from person to person and takes root like a seed in a person and becomes the disease within them, rather than simply bad air. Now, again, they're simply just throwing out some ideas here, and these ideas had been proposed before plague, but they take off much more in the later 15th and 16th centuries as sort of an early germ theory. Again, it's not supported by any sort of lab or microscopic evidence, but they're playing with the idea of pathogenic microscopic organisms causing disease. So, again, hardly overnight, but I feel the Black Death was a major spur towards getting some doctors to think differently about disease.
Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting how close you can sort of see medieval doctors and then later sort of, I guess, early modern doctors get to correctly diagnosing the problem and issue. Because even if we laugh, you might say, at miasma theory now, but if we understand bubonic death, if we understand the plague transmitted through, respiratory, that's very close to what they thought, that it was a result of bad air.
Yeah, it's what I always tell my students. Medieval does not equal stupid. They have a different framework for understanding the world, but they're as good as us at observing the world around them, trying to make a rational judgment of what is happening. How is this disease being spread? And within that framework, miasmatic theory makes sense.
Gotcha. And then if I can ask maybe a closing question with respect to the aftermath, were later outbreaks after the Black Death, as we call it, any less severe in casualties than the first wave, in 1348? Do we see a decline slowly in casualties? Because I know that you mentioned how at first what we call the Black Death, it was catastrophic. 50% is just wiped off. But do later waves that we get of Yersinia pestis, do they decrease in the casualties?
Yeah, they certainly do. And there's a lot of debate about whether surviving Europeans had developed some sort of immunity. Doesn't seem like it, because today people can die just as easily of the plague as 700 years ago. But in general, almost all later outbreaks of plague in Europe that have been studied were lower than the Black Death. Again, I'm going to just throw out a number here, but we're looking at more in the 10 to 20% range of mortality. Of course, that is still catastrophic. But it is not as world-shaking as half of everyone. It could be 1 in 10, 2 in 10. But there's not a gradual decline. There seems to be spikes every once in a while. And some of the most famous early modern plagues stand out for much higher mortality rates. So there was a plague in Milan and Rome in the 1630s. Many of the listeners will know about the Great Plague of London in 1665, which later encouraged Daniel Defoe to write his Diary of a Plague Year. And then the last one of all in Western Europe, the Great Plague of Marseille in the 1720s. So all of these were noteworthy for higher mortality rates, not as high as the Black Death, and more widespread coverage. But none of them ever had the continental pandemic spread of the Black Death, which makes it so much more noteworthy and devastating.
Right, right. All right, then. Well, I figured we're coming close to the end of our interview, and I just wanted to ask some maybe closing questions. What resources or books or even articles would you recommend for our listeners who might want to learn more about the Black Death or medieval medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. Not surprisingly, there is a huge number of publications about the Black Death. It's a favorite perennial topic. People are morbid. They love to hear about it. But not surprisingly, a lot of it is problematic. Some of it's just outdated and doesn't build on the latest research, which is why I would point all of the readers to go to the primary sources. Because it's been studied so much, the plague has a lot of the documents have been translated into modern English, and these are easily available. One of the biggest is Rosemary Horrocks, published in the 1990s, a collection simply called The Black Death, with hundreds of primary sources in modern English translation, with accessible introductions. A shorter, more recent one by a scholar named John Aberth. He published, again, it's called The Black Death. It's what you call these books. The Black Death, The Great Mortality of 1348 to 1350. What I like about his book is he looks at a bigger geographical scope than Horrocks, bringing in Islamic and Byzantine, Greek, and North African sources, as well as just European. So both of those are very accessible. But if people are looking for a secondary source, again, John Aberth is really the author. He's very prolific, written a lot of books, but I would point to two of his most recent books, a textbook, again, simply called The Black Death, and another book called Doctoring the Black Death, which obviously the latter is looking at how doctors approached it. But his books present some of the latest summaries of what, based on the latest research that we know about the Black Death, I should say, in Europe. There's other researchers. Listeners might want to look for Monica Green, who's especially been one of the main authors to look at the hemispheric perspective of how do we understand the big picture of the second plague pandemic, probably beginning in Central Asia, spreading to China and Europe and Africa. And her works are a bit more technical as they're building on the paleogenetic evidence. For those looking at the truly big picture, pretty much anything recently by her about the Black Death is the best place to go.
Very interesting. And then I guess maybe for a closing question, if I can ask, do you think any apt comparisons can be drawn between the outbreaks and responses to the plague in the mid 14th century and the outbreak of COVID? That I guess we're still going through today.
Yeah. Oh, I've given a lot of interviews in the last 3 years about Black Death, and the way I respond now, of course, is very different from the middle of 2020.
Sure.
Yeah, on a somber note, we need to recognize 15 to 20 million people have died in the last 3 years from COVID or COVID-related illnesses. And while the percentage is much lower than the Black Death, we are frighteningly creeping towards levels of devastating plague outbreaks. Maybe not the Black Death, but so I guess what I would say about that is, on the one hand, we want to think epidemiologically and scientifically. Plague is a bacterial disease, and COVID is a viral disease. and they spread in some ways very differently. And we need to react to and think about the microorganisms, the pathogens differently. But at the same time, we're human beings, and these are highly infectious diseases. And in some ways, we haven't changed that much since the 14th century. I think there were small degrees of panic in both 1348 and 2020. On the one hand, I do think contemporary people should be very proud of what humanity did, though, in 2020, where almost globally we reacted what I think is the right way in terms of isolation, social distancing, masking. We all remember how quiet that year was.
Yeah.
Wow. And I think medieval people, while they did listen to their doctors, they of course did not understand the pathogens. And it seems that within a matter of months, they went back even more quickly than we tried to, back to the way life was before.
Mm.
And it's hard to prove this, but I feel that this probably is one of the reasons why plague continued to persist and spread so virulently, or I shouldn't use that word, that's viruses, but so violently in 1349 through 1353. So yeah, I warn people to make two facile comparisons between the Black Death and COVID, while at the same time recognizing that the way our bodies work and the way we react in crisis hasn't changed that much since the 14th century.
Mm.
What we have now is, I would say, actually the right answer. And we have been and should continue to listen to public health officials, epidemiologists, and COVID specialists. That's what we have now that we, of course, didn't have anywhere from the 14th until the 20th century.
Right, right. Well, Dr. Black, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. It's been a great pleasure talking with you.